Hey fam, we're back with another banger. What if Edward became the mythical first vampire? So before we start, if you are craving adult mature content, join my Patreon now, link are in the description box. Alright, enough talk, let's fire it up. Forks, Washington, 1948. Edward looked around the quaint country house that would be their new home for the next couple of years. It wasn't horrible, but Esme was determined to decorate it into her favorite style, whatever that was. It was the first new home they had been to since she had joined their makeshift family. And she was excited to put her mark on it. Edward and Carlisle were fine with that, considering their other homes were sparse and bland. Having a house that felt like a home was a welcomed normality in their strange world. Edward walked around the second floor, noting that there were more rooms than the four of them would need, before he moved up to the third floor. He hoped one of the rooms could be set aside for his piano. And maybe a library would be nice. With only Carlisle, Esme, Rosalie, and Edward living there, each person could have 3 rooms to themselves and still have space to spare. Room to grow, Esme had insisted when they had first looked at the house. Edward didn't know why they would grow, unless Rosalie and he found their mates. But Edward couldn't see himself with anyone, and Rosalie was a bitch. Edward loved her like a sister, but even he admitted that it would take a special man to put up with her. Edward, Esme called from downstairs, come help us move things. Come on, precious Edward, you have to pull your weight too, Rose's taunting voice followed. Edward frowned and tucked his hands into his trouser pockets, thinking of all the horrible things he could call Rosalie once he got down there. It was only Esme's sweet smile greeting him that mellowed his mood. He picked up their new yellow couch, which was quite fashionable, yet hideously ugly, in Edward's opinion. Where would you like this, Esme? We've designated the back room as the living room. The one with the French doors opening up to the backyard. Edward nodded in understanding, and carried the couch through the hallway, making sure he hit the top of Rosalie's head. She glared at him and yelled, "Ass," in her head so Esme couldn't hear. Edward smirked and mouthed, "Which," before carrying on with his chore. He dropped the couch in the middle of the room, knowing that wherever he put it, Esme and Rosalie would just move it anyway. Where's Carlisle? He asked. Getting a job at the hospital, Rose replied. She brought in a recliner chair and shot a withering glare at Edward when the couch blocked her from entering the room further. Oh, of course. We're going by Gaskell here, in case you forgot. I hadn't. Edward shot back. Right, so he has to send in his new information, including last name. Really, you're the mind reader. Shouldn't you know all this? I do try to give you your privacy. Rosalie snorted and turned away from Edward. Our beds are outside. I've already claimed the bedroom at the front of the house on the second floor. And Esme says your piano should be arriving later today. Edward practically glowed at the excitement of having a piano again. They had been on the move for the past 4 years and Edward desperately missed being able to play a piano when he wanted to get away from the world. Or from himself. Now he would finally have a piano at his disposal, and his appeasement for being dragged around the country for 4 years, and, Edward liked to think, putting up Rosalie along the way. Esme and Carlisle allowed Edward to choose whatever piano he liked. The rest of the day was spent moving furniture around and painting. Edward stayed in his designated room at the back of the house, setting up his new bookshelves and organizing his library in alphabetical order, and then again by genre. Anything to avoid getting forced to paint and decorate. Carlisle arrived later that night and Esme proudly walked him throughout the house, preening under the praise Carlisle gave her. Edward felt the familiar pang in his chest that he always got when he watched others with their mates. He loved his family, and was happy that he wasn't wandering somewhere alone, but he wanted nothing more than a mate. He desperately wanted someone who would love him and stay with him forever. Carlisle had hoped that person would be Rosalie, but Edward knew it wasn't. He loved Rose and admitted she was beautiful, but he would never be in love with her. To pretend or use each other for temporary relief would be cruel, because somewhere out there Rosalie had a mate waiting. And hopefully so did Edward. The piano arrived later that night and He set it up in the corner of the living room. Edward hid his disappointment because he knew that Esme loved hearing him play, but secretly he wanted some privacy. He would never get that though, and part of him didn't think he deserved it. Esme never had privacy around Edward. Her thoughts were laid bare before him, and thoughts were the most private thing a person could have. So if he had to share his playing, he supposed he could have worse penance for constantly stealing the private thoughts of those around him. He played all night long, and for the first time since becoming a vampire, Edward D was happy that he didn't have to sleep anymore. By the next morning he was no longer out of practice, and no one would have ever guessed that he hadn't touched a piano in years. Edward stopped playing immediately, his fingers hovering over the keys like a statue. Esme rushed into the room in a panic that Edward had never seen before. "Esme, what's wrong? Carlyle just called. He had a run-in with someone at the hospital. Someone who knew he was a vampire. They have set up a meeting for tonight. How could anyone know what we are? They're from the reservation," Esme said ominously. The man said he knew Carlyle from their legends. "Oh, what if they tell someone?" "Calm down, Esme," Edward sighed. He gently took her by the shoulders and guided her to the couch. "There's nothing to be worried about. Even if someone said something about us, nobody would believe them. As long as we stay calm, everything will be fine." "You're right, of course, Edward. It's just been so nice here, having a home and settling in. I don't want to lose that." "We won't. We'll meet with the man, ask him what he wants in exchange for his silence, and continue on as if nothing has happened." As much as he assured Esme that nothing would go wrong, Edward wasn't as convinced himself. He could only suspect whom Carlyle had met in the hospital, and if he was right, it didn't bode well for their family. Edward had been set against living in Forks, Washington for one reason: the Quileute tribe. Edward had taken some anthropology courses at college, and in one of them they had studied the legends of Native Americans. One legend in particular had caught Edward's eye, and that was the legend of the Cold Ones, from the Quileute tribe. Amazed that his own species had made it into legend, Edward had learned as much about the tribe as he could. So when Carlyle had suggested Forks, and Edward recognized the name of the town, he tried to convince the rest of his family that this was a bad idea. But who would believe legends? The family thought, and so they moved in. And here they were. A ball of dread was forming in Edward's stomach at the idea of meeting the man tonight. Something told Edward it was going to be life-changing. This was confirmed even more once Edward found himself standing in the woods later that night at the border of what he now knew was the La Push Reservation. "This is where he told us to meet," Carlyle muttered. He had been visibly shaken when he had returned from the hospital that day. The man had been violent and confrontational, and it took all of Lee's control not to attack and defend his family. "They're coming," Edward warned. He could hear bits of thoughts getting closer. One of them was louder than the others, more hesitant yet determined. The Cullens stood closer and took defensive stances, in case they were to be attacked. "We won't hurt you," a voice called from the trees. "You'll forgive us if we don't trust you," Carlyle said. Ward strained to hear the minds of the men. Their superior vampire hearing gave them one advantage, so they knew that there was a group of 15 men moving into position so that they were surrounding them. "Why should you fear us? You are the killers here," the same voice said. "We are just food to you." "No, you are not our food. Our family only eats animals. We will not hurt you. We just want to live a quiet life here for a few years." Laughter echoed around the trees. One laugh was louder than the others, and at that moment a man stepped out from the trees. Edward's breath caught as the beautiful man was illuminated by the moonlight. His golden skin and long black hair gleamed brilliantly. There was something about this man that called to Edward. He had something special and wonderful about him. "A vampire that does not eat humans. I have never heard of that." "It is rare, I will give you that," Carlyle admitted. "But I assure you, my family means you no harm. We do not hunt humans and we will not hunt you. If you let us live in peace, it will be like we were never here." The native man regarded Carlyle briefly, then let his eyes wander to Esme and Rosalie. Then his eyes finally met Edward's. Edward couldn't tear himself away from the gaze. He didn't know what was happening to him, why he felt like this man was important. He knew it wasn't his mate. Vampire knew their mates immediately. And this man was not Edward's mate. But then why did he elicit this reaction? "My name is Ephraim Black. I am the tribal elder of this land," Ephraim said regally. "My name is Carlyle Cullen," Carlyle said. "And this is my wife and mate Esme, and our children Edward and Rosalie." Ephraim quirked an eyebrow cynically when Carlyle said, "Wife, and children, but he didn't comment. Instead he moved on to the more important matters. Why have you moved here, vampire? As I told you, we have been nomadic for several years and wanted a home so we could settle down. We did not know that you were here and have no intention of posing you any sort of threat. Are there more of you? No, it is just us. If any other vampires were to pass through, they would not be from our family. Ephraim was silent, but Edward could hear all the thoughts passing through his head. He was still untrusting of Carlyle when he said that they would not harm his tribe, yet Ephraim was a fair man and believed in giving chances. Edward knew that this meeting would end well, though both sides would have to compromise. I will allow you to stay, Ephraim said at several moments of consideration. A murmur of disapproval swept through the forest, but Ephraim held his hand and all went silent again. I still do not trust you fully though, and that is why I have decided on these rules. A treaty, if you will. If you follow them, my tribe will not attack you. Edward heard Rosalie's inner snort as she wondered what they could possibly do to them. But Edward knew the threat was real. He could see in Ephraim's mind great men who could shift into werewolves. He saw a beautiful russet wolf rip the head off a vampire who had threatened to kill his wife. This tribe was a force to be reckoned with, and as such would have to be respected. Of course, we will agree to any terms. First, you will never cross this boundary where we stand. If you enter Quileute territory, you will die. Understood. Of course, Carlyle agreed. Second, if you ever bite a human, you declare war with our people. I don't care if it is an accident or not, if you bite a human, we will kill you all. Carlyle hesitated for a moment before agreeing. In theory it was a reasonable law, in practice however, it was a difficult thing to have hanging over a vampire's head. You are our enemies, Ephraim warned. I am friendly to you now because I do not know you, but I still do not trust you. Stay away from our tribe and leave quickly. We hope to stay here for several years, Carlyle said. Then don't do anything to make us kill you. Ephraim said, rather offhandedly in Edward's opinion. When none of the vampires said anything against Ephraim's treaty, he signaled the other men in the forest. They walked back around, releasing the Cullens from their confinement. Ephraim turned his back and started to walk away before looking over his shoulder. Remember, vampires, bite a human or step onto our land, and we'll kill you or run you out of town. As Ephraim walked away, Edward grappled with the odd emotions he was experiencing. Something deep within him wanted him to follow the man. He wanted to stay with him, knowing there was something important and precious that he had. Edward just didn't know what it was yet. So with a final glance back, Edward followed his family to their house. They stayed in Forks for 3 years before deciding to move to Alaska with the Denali clan. It had been a great 3 years and they all were sad to leave Forks, but it was time. Carlyle had set up a meeting with Ephraim Black to inform him that they would be leaving and they hadn't decided when they would come back. After coming home the night when they made the treaty, Edward had told his family about he had learned and how the tribe had the capability to turn in the wolves. They were more cautious after that, and it was one of the reasons they were leaving Forks so soon. Esme and Rosalie were still relatively new to the vampire lifestyle, and they lived in constant fear of a slip-up. So after years of worrying, they decided that to be safe and honor the laws of the treaty, they would leave Forks and return at a time when they were more confident that they wouldn't accidentally entice the tribe's wrath. Edward and Carlyle waited at the border for Ephraim and any other tribesmen to show up. Even after all these years, Edward was still reluctant to see Ephraim. Late at night he would sometimes hear a whisper or feel a pull, drawing him towards La Push. A few times he even found himself standing at the border, fighting with himself not to cross and discover what it was that made Ephraim so important. Leaving now would be difficult for Edward. He wasn't upset that he was leaving Ephraim. Ephraim himself didn't matter, but Edward knew that by leaving Forks he was leaving something important behind. Something connected to Ephraim. What that was, Edward couldn't even begin to contemplate. Ephraim emerged from the woods, again followed by a group of men. What do you want, Cullen? I wanted to let you know that my family and I are leaving Forks for the time being. Ephraim's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Are you leaving for good? We love Forks and have found a home here. However, after much discussion, we have decided that it is better if we leave. My wife and Rose are still new to this lifestyle, and we would hate to break the treaty because of an accident. So we will leave for now. But we will return. We are keeping our house and much of the furniture that can be saved will be put into storage. And you will return. Yes, though we don't know when. It may be decades before we return. But I'm sure one day we will. Fine, but remember Cullen, the treaty still stands. When, if, you ever return. That treaty is binding, Ephraim warned. Of course, I understand. You're in our books now, future generations will know of you. Don't think that you'll be allowed to come back and not abide by our rules. I would expect nothing less. Without a parting nod or farewell, Ephraim turned away and disappeared into the woods. Carlyle heaved a heavy sigh. Were all wolves so difficult? He wondered. Before starting back for the house, Edward started to follow but was stopped by the odd tugging trying to keep him there. Edward took another fleeting glance in the direction of La Push and wondered what was there that drew Edward. What was calling him? He stood in the quiet forest, surrounded by the sounds of birds, bugs, and wildlife. And he waited, desperate. Ely wanting to know what it was he was missing. Edward, Carlyle called. Hurry up, Kate is expecting us by 2. Edward stood another moment longer then gathered all his self-control and walked away from the La Push reservation. Had he known that it would take another 60 years before he would return, he might have waited a moment longer. 2005. Do you have everything? Yes, Alice, for the last time. I have everything you asked me to get, Jasper said. He was trying really hard not to snap at his mate, but Edward could hear the frustration in his thoughts. Alice was the most excited about the family's new move to Forks. She had been planning and packing for weeks, telling everyone exactly where their new rooms would be, which really only applied to Edward because she liked his view. Beston was kicking him out of his old room and putting him across the hall. It was the same view, in his opinion, but apparently there was a tree that Alice really wanted a view of and it could only be seen from that room. She had also planned how things would be packed for ease of unpacking, and had already checked in what condition everything would be in after being stored for almost 60 years. Edward ignored most of what she said. His piano, supposedly, was intact and only needed to be tuned, so he was happy. Esme was joining in with Alice's enthusiasm, telling her all about the house and the surrounding forests. While it was true that few places in the world had all the benefits that Forks did as far as perfect conditions for vampires, Edward wondered if Esme was idealizing it a bit much. Sure, the house in Forks had been beautiful in the 40s. They had no way of knowing if it would actually be as wonderful as they thought it had been. Even Rosalie was looking forward to moving back to Forks. Of course for Rosalie. Her swinging endorsement came as, the place wasn't a total piece of shit. Emmett followed whatever his wife said, and so with that it was agreed. The Cullen family was moving back to Forks, Washington. They hoped that, even with Jasper's strained control, the rest of the family would be able to keep him in line and they would be able to stay in Forks longer than they had before. Enrollment in the local school had already been arranged and the family joked that Alice and Edward would be the oldest-looking freshmen that Forks High School would ever have. They hoped that they would be able to stay at Forks at least as long as it would take the last of them to graduate high school. So with Edward and Alice starting as freshmen they at least had 4 years. None of the kids were particularly thrilled about having to go to high school again, especially Edward, considering he had just finished his doctorate in medical science. But it was a small price to pay for having a steady home. Are you excited, Edward? Alice asked. Her joy was clear in the grin stretched across her face and the annoying way she was bouncing on the balls of her feet. About moving? Sure, I suppose. Forks was a nice place to live. Is that the only reason you're happy? Edward whirled around at her thought. What do you mean? It's just that I've been seeing something. It's not clear, but it's good. A picture of Ephraim Black flashed in Edward's mind but he pushed it aside. He was probably dead, which would mean that Edward's fascination with him should have vanished. There was no reason to think of him anymore. It's nothing, Edward sighed, keeping his voice light to hide the tension in his voice. I'm sure you're just seeing us being excited about seeing things that are familiar. No, it's not that. This is about you, Alice said. She cocked her head to the side and observed Edward, focusing intently on him. Edward stood still, brushing her mind with his to find what she was thinking. Alice's eyes glazed over and Edward was able to catch a glimpse of the color tan, before Alice closed her mind off. Edward hated not knowing what her visions were, especially when they pertained to him. So as soon as her face cleared and became more aware, Edward started questioning her. What did you see? Was it about me? Alice shook her head slowly, a soft smile creeping onto her face. Not now, Edward. The timing isn't right. The timing. Edward protested. What does that even mean? Please, Alice, just tell me. I said no, Edward. I can't tell you yet. She pushed past him and down the stairs, leaving Edward alone in his empty room wondering what she could possibly have seen. Recognizing defeat, he picked up the last box of books and CDs and carried it down to the waiting car. Rosalie and Emmett were already pulling out with one of the 3 cars they were taking. Alice and Jasper got into the second car, and Edward assumed he would be riding with Carlisle and Esme. As the odd man out, he somehow always was forced to be with the adults. Esme took one last lingering look at the house they were leaving. I'll miss this house. But the house in Forks is larger. It will comfortably fit all of us. That's true, Esme said. She gracefully slid into the passenger seat, and as soon as Edward had pulled his backpack out of the truck, whoever had put it there obviously hadn't been listening when he had explicitly said it would be traveling with him. Carlisle started the car. Not to mention it'll be interesting to see how our things held up over the years. We'll have to go shopping as soon as we get there. I'll start making a list. Despite their vampire brains and abilities to remember everything told to them, Esme still enjoyed making lists of things she needed to do. She said it made her feel more maternal and normal, and the family had stopped teasing her about it after she had vindictively refused to do anything for them that wasn't put in a list. For an entire week no clothes were washed, nothing was fixed, and nothing new was bought. They learned their lesson quickly, and now Esme's lists were a sacred item in the household. To be valued and respected rather than mocked. Is there anything you need, Edward? Esme asked, looking at him through the mirror of the widow's shade. No, as long as my piano is still in good condition. Though we might need a new car since we're planning on staying here a while and we're only bringing 3 cars with us. Oh yes, of course. We'll have to find a way around that. Since we're enrolling you as freshmen and sophomores, none of you should be able to drive. Esme frowned while she thought about that. Well, just don't drive into town and be careful when you do drive. The rest of the car ride was filled with small talk and silence. Moving from Maine to Washington would normally take days, however when they only had to stop for gas and could drive well beyond the speed limit, Hat should have been around a 3-day drive was only 1.5. Soon they were pulling into the town of Forks, watching and seeing that little had changed in 60 years. Buildings had been fixed up and painted. There were more cars on the road, and some shops were missing and had been replaced with boring office buildings, but otherwise Forks looked like it had been untouched by time. The Y pulled onto the overgrown lane leading up to the isolated Cullen home. Again, Edward was struck by how it didn't look changed at all. They had paid for someone to mow the lawn, open the house up and clean the dust and windows, and check the roof to see if it needed to be fixed. With all that done, the house was move-in ready. All they had to do was rearrange their furniture as the girls saw fit. Edward was the first in the door, heading straight to his piano which was still sitting in the corner of the living room. He lifted the lid and played a few keys. They were in tune and Edward was happy that someone, probably Alice, had also thought to get someone to tune his piano before they arrived. Once again, Edward, you always leave us to do the work. Get your ass out there and move some boxes. Rosalie yelled as she walked into the room with some suitcases. I'm going, I just had to check my piano. Just fucking marry the thing, Rose sneered. Rosalie, language, Esme scolded, walking in behind them. She looked around and gave a delighted sigh. Everything looks wonderful. Oh, I'm so glad we're back here. This is a nice pad, Emmett said, carrying in luggage. I dig it. Emmett, no one says that anymore. Stop trying to sound cool because you only sound like an idiot, Edward sighed. Fuck off, Edward, Rosalie practically growled. Emmett is cooler than you, so you really don't have a leg to stand on. Criticizing him. It was only Esme's presence that stopped Edward from retaliating. She frowned deeply at her children, so Edward simply ignored Rosalie and brushed past her to go outside and bring in some boxes. Carlisle was outside inspecting the house when Edward walked up to him. They both looked out at the woods and looked back at each other, each knowing what the other was thinking. We'll have to inform the Quileute tribe that we've moved back. We should do that as soon as possible. I'm sure we can check in the phone book for the Black's phone number. I doubt Ephraim is still alive. And we have no way of knowing who the tribal elder is now, Edward Said. Carlyle hummed in agreement. You and I will go to the meeting. If all of us come, I don't want us to seem intimidating or threatening. The less confrontational we seem the better. Only if they want to meet all of us will the rest of the family come. Should I try to find the phone number of someone on the reservation? Yes. Look for anyone with the last name Black who lives in La Push. We'll try them first. Edward nodded in agreement and went inside to hook up his computer to the internet and try to find a phone guide. It was easy, and within minutes Edward had the phone number of a William Black on the La Push reservation. He wrote the number on a slip of paper and went in search of Carlyle. In the time that he had spoken to Carlyle and found the phone number, Esme, Alice, and Rosalie had set up the living room and kitchen, and Emmett had finished bringing in all the boxes and luggage from the 3 cars. Heading up the stairs, Edward heard Carlyle's thoughts about organizing his medical books. Knowing exactly what that meant, Edward went straight up to the 3rd level into Carlyle's office. Carlyle was inspecting the bookshelves, balancing a pile of books in one hand and sorting them alphabetically with the other. I found a phone number for a William Black. It's the only Black living in La Push. Thank you, Edward. Do you have your cell phone? I'd like to call him now, but the phone in here hasn't been hooked up yet. Edward fished his phone out of his pocket and passed it to Carlyle. He sat down on a chair, curiosity and something he couldn't identify compelling him to listen in on the conversation. It was odd to be so close to the source of his obsession. In the 60 years since they had been away from Forks, Edward had never forgotten his compulsion to follow Ephraim. He still didn't understand it, and a part of him wondered if he would have the same pull towards this other Black. Carlyle sat on the edge of the desk and dialed. Edward could hear the phone ringing before the line picked up and a gruff voice was heard over the phone. Hello. Hello, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for Ephraim Black, and you were the only Black I could find in the phone book. Do you know how to get in contact with him? There was silence on the line, Henna rustling like the phone was being shifted to another hand. Ephraim's dead. This is his son. I'm sorry, Carlyle apologized. I didn't know. And your name is? Carlyle looked at the name on the sheet of paper, William. Billy Black. And you are? My name is Carlyle Cullen. The sharp intake of breath told Edward and Carlyle all they needed to know. Ephraim had made sure to tell his son all about them. And Billy probably wasn't the only one who knew about them. Cullen, Billy hissed. What are you doing back here? That is why I have called you. We've moved back, but I.W. Anted to meet with you to assure you that we will continue to abide by the treaty. We are not here to harm you or your tribe. I'd like to set up a meeting with the tribal elders and discuss this. I assume that you are the chief. You plan to stick to the treaty. Edward could hear the disbelief in Billy's voice, and didn't really blame him. If their situations were reversed, Edward wouldn't want to be within 10 feet of Billy. Yes, my family has been informed and all agree. Billy was quiet and only the sound of his breathing could be heard. Fine, we'll meet tonight at 11. The boundary line. How many of there are you? It will just be my son Edward and me. The rest of the family will stay behind, unless you want them there. No, just you and the boy. But don't think that you can trick us. No hiding others in the woods to attack us. If there is anyone else, the treaty will be broken and you'll pay. Of course not. We won't do anything to break the treaty. We'll be there at 11 tonight. Without another word Billy hung up. Carlyle sighed and passed the phone back to Edward. Well, hopefully they won't be too difficult. Billy sounded a lot less willing to cooperate than Ephraim was, Edward pointed out. That's true, but when the treaty was first made Ephraim didn't know what exactly living with us around would be like. Now he's told others and we don't know how we're perceived there. We should be prepared for them to demand more out of the treaty. That's hardly fair. We have a right to live here if we want. It's not like we're on their reservation. Their tribe has werewolf blood flowing through them. With us here it is possible that gene will be activated, and as you know, werewolves and vampires are natural enemies. So their trepidation, while frustrating, is understandable. That is why we must be willing to be amenable to their requests. I'll ask you to pay attention to their thoughts and see if there is anything in spoken that will help our meeting be productive. Of course, Edward Said. He gracefully lifted himself from the chair. I'll be setting up my room. I'll find you 5 minutes to 11. Perfect. Edward spent the next several hours organizing his books and music. When he was done with that, he went downstairs and started setting up his sheet music. He kept his entire music book and self-composition collection in a small F.L. drawer that he carried around with him from place to place. Sometimes he kept the file in his room so that it would be out of the way, but this house was big enough that Edward could leave it right next to the piano and it wouldn't take up valuable space. He didn't need the books as much anymore, having memorized most of it. But he liked to keep the books, as mementos of sorts. There wasn't logic to it. Because once he memorized something, his vampire mind wouldn't forget it. It was only a reminder of when he would need them. Another book to add to his collection. The more it grew, the more accomplished he felt. And it was an accomplishment he could actually feel proud of because it was something he had worked for. Edward looked up and found Carlyle looking down on him expectantly. He glanced over at the clock and found that it was already time to leave. That was another thing he loved about his music. Time would pass and he would barely notice. I'm coming. Do you have a plan about what you're going to say? I was just going to wait and let them talk first. I think that's the best we can do, Edward agreed. They took off through the woods, running at maximum speed through the trees and brush. The last place they had lived didn't have the forest that Forks had, and it was invigorating to be able to run at top speed through a forest knowing that it was large and new. That few people would venture out that far. They quickly reached the border, knowing immediately where to stop. Almost instantly they could hear footsteps coming closer and smell the human blood. Minutes later, 9 Native Americans emerged from the woods. Finally the last man came forward and Edward couldn't pay attention to anyone else. Edward knew this was Billy Black. He looked almost identical to Ephraim Black, though he had a scowl on his face that Ephraim lacked both times they had met. Billy had an air of a leader around him, commanding attention from everyone, despite his wheelchair. The blood of the leader flowed strong in Billy's veins. Even more, though, Edward felt a stronger pull towards Billy than he had Ephraim. Just like Ephraim, something in Billy called to Edward, and he didn't understand it at all. Hello, Carlyle spoke into the silence. I'm Carlyle Cullen, this is my son Edward. We know who you are, Billy said. You look just as my father said. What do you want? We just wanted to let you know that we have moved back. We don't want to fight with you at all, and that is why we decided to tell you right away. We don't want to seem like we are breaking the treaty. Same house. Yes. Why'd you come back here? We don't want you here, a man to the side of Billy said. Billy held out his hand to silence the man. I'm going to be fair about this. But you should know that we'll be keeping an eye on you. One step out of line, and you're out of here. Understand? Billy asked. He never took his gaze off the vampires, and it allowed Edward to look into his eyes and mind and try to learn what it was about him that Edward yearned so much to have. He was so engrossed in trying to understand Billy that he missed most of the meeting and was only back to his thoughts by Billy's final warning. You will never touch our land. If you do, we will kill you. We want nothing to do with you, and it is only our basic belief in rights that is forcing me to allow you to stay here. But I'll try to kick you out as soon as I can. Our families aren't safe when you're here. Our tribe isn't safe when you're here. One step out of line. We understand, Billy. We only want to live. Diet is still one of animals, and while I would never be arrogant enough to say that we are never tempted, we do have enough control to resist. Billy just snorted and turned his wheelchair around, effectively ending the conversation. I don't pity you, Cullen, and I don't like you. You and your family are monsters. Stick to the treaty and then leave as soon as possible. The rest of the men followed Billy back into the forest, and it was only once they were gone that Carlyle and Edward relaxed. They raced back to the house to tell everyone how the meeting had gone. Later that night Edward was lying on his couch looking up at the ceiling. He had never been an overly emotional person, however it seemed like every time he was in Forks emotions he didn't understand always surfaced. He had thought it was only something to do with Ephraim. Perhaps the leader in him called to Edward, though why that would be, Edward didn't know. But the same thing had happened with Billy, only it was more intense. Each time Edward felt like he needed to follow them, like they would bring him home. Edward huffed and rolled over on his side. These emotions were ridiculous. Lust he could understand, but this certainly wasn't lust. He felt nothing for the men themselves, it was only what he felt they could give him that attracted him to them. Then Edward remembered something during the meeting. Billy had mentioned family and a pair of warm, loving brown eyes had flashed in his head. Those eyes wouldn't leave Edward alone. He squeezed his eyes shut tightly, trying to bring back very detail of them to see if he could figure out why they were so special, but again, Edward was left with more questions than answers. It was pointless to try to understand this when he didn't even know what it was he was trying to understand, so he gave up. Needing to distract himself, Edward went to his piano to spend the next several hours losing himself in his music. "Edward," Alice said, breaking him away from his song. My car needs to have its engine looked at. Will you take it to the mechanics today?" Edward stopped playing and scrutinized Alice. "Why don't you have Rosalie look at it?" "Because we're going to Port Angeles to go shopping and I really want my car to be looked at tomorrow." "So why don't you make your husband do it?" "Trust me, Edward, it has to be you." Alice's tone caught Edward's attention. "What did you see?" he asked. She just smiled and stood up. "Today at 3 o'clock. They'll be busy so you'll have to wait around a bit, but it has to be 3. "Why can't I go earlier when I don't have to wait?" 3, Alice said firmly, and Edward knew not to argue with her. He wasn't thrilled about having to take Alice's car to the mechanics. Carlyle had to come with him since they were trying to pretend that Edward was only 15, but Alice still insisted that Edward had to be there. So 3 o'clock saw Edward and Carlyle sitting in the mechanics' waiting room waiting for the opportunity to fill out some paperwork. Edward was looking around, trying to figure out why it was Alice was so insistent that he be there. So far nothing had happened. The place was busy, and Edward was starting to feel sick from the smell of blood, sweat, and engine oil. His phone beeped and Edward opened it to find a text message from Alice. "Go outside. Dumpsters. I'm going to get some fresh air," Edward told Carlyle. "Okay, I'll find you when I'm done here." Edward nodded and walked out the door. He looked up and down the street trying to spot whatever dumpster Alice was talking about. The street was clear, and to the left of the building was the car shop, so Edward went right. Almost immediately he spotted an alley and turned into in. Rustling could be heard coming from the dumpsters in the alley, and Edward was instantly confronted with someone's ass hanging out of one of them. "Wire, more wires, shitty spark plug. Where's all the good stuff?" Jackpot. "Gas tank, that could be useful. Some dings, but I can fix that." Edward read the unidentified ass's thoughts for a moment before an inexplicable urge overcame him, and he cleared his throat. The ass man froze, then quickly raised his head, hitting it hard on the lid that was propped open. "Ow, that hurt." The kid, for he couldn't have been more than 14, rubbed his head as he scrambled out of the dumpster, a beat-up gas tank clutched in his left hand. Edward watched in amusement as the kid tried to make himself seem innocent, before he asked, "Hey kid, what are you doing?" Edward never heard the reply. For as soon as the boy raised his head to look at Edward, all thoughts fled his mind. The boy had deep russet skin and shoulder-length black hair that was wind blown and had some leaves in it, though to Edward it only made him look perfectly childlike, like he had been playing in the forest before coming to that spot to change Edward's life. And his eyes, Edward recognized them instantly. They were the same eyes that Ephraim and Billy Black had. The same eyes Billy had thought of when he mentioned family. The warm, beautiful brown eyes that currently sparkled with contrived innocence and defiance. They sent a bolt of lighting down Edward's spine, and Edward knew, this kid, this Quileute boy, was his mate. Edward stared at his mate, unable to tear his eyes away from the sight of the boy. He caught himself studying every little thing about him, from the perfect dark tone of his skin to the way the sunlight hit his raven hair. Hey, I'm talking to you, hello." Edward shook himself out of his thoughts and realized his mate was talking to him. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked. The boy raised an eyebrow. "You're the one who found me. What do you want?" "Oh, right, well." Edward floundered, "Well, I was just wondering what you were doing in the trash." The boy blushed and Edward thought that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His skin took on a beautiful rosy glow. And just the smell of his blood was enough to entice Edward to press him against the walls and tuck his head into the boy's neck. Edward had to clench his hands together to stop himself from doing just that. "I was looking for spare parts," the boy muttered. "There are plenty of spare parts in the shop, Edward pointed out. Yeah, overpriced ones, he muttered. Ones I can't afford, the boy thought. What's your name? Edward blurted out, unable to contain himself. The boy stiffened and eyed Edward cautiously. Why do you want to know? Edward shrugged, I'm new here. Today's my first day and you look to be about my age, I just wanted to know your age. I'm Jacob Black, and I don't think you're my age. Edward could barely respond, so thrilled he was that he had his mate's name, Jacob. Edward was sure it was the best name ever. He inwardly winced at how corny and cliché he sounded, but he couldn't bring himself to care. His mate was finally here. He had waited for him for 100 years. He patiently sat through his siblings' opulent and frequent weddings, and his parents' simpler ones. He was never that bitter when he heard them exchange loving words late at night whilst he sat alone in his room, reading. And now his time was finally here. I'm Edward Cullen. Do you live in Forks? Edward knew the answer already. He knew more about Jacob than Jacob probably knew himself. But, of course, Jacob didn't know that. No, the La Push reservation about 20 minutes away. And you came here too. Raid the trash. Yep, got a problem with that. Jacob's eyes flashed. And Edward got the feeling that Jacob was used to having to defend himself. That was confirmed when he caught images of older boys teasing him good-naturedly, and Jacob tackling one of them for making fun of him. No, not at all, Edward Said. What are you going to do with that? He nodded towards the gas tank that Jacob still had clutched in his hands. I'm going to fix it up. Then maybe put it in a car. You rebuild cars. When I don't have to do homework, Jacob joked. He was starting to lighten up around Edward, and when Jacob smiled and laughed, Edward swore his brain short-wired for a moment. Where do you go to school? The res has its own school. I go there. That's too bad, it would have been nice to go to school together. I don't think you're in 8th grade like me, Jacob said. Riley. No, I'm in 9th, Edward Said, mentally calculating how old his mate could possibly be. Too young, that was for sure. 8th grade, that made Jacob only about 13 or 14 years old. Far too young to be able to handle being a vampire's mate and even far too young for a serious relationship with any kind of substance. Edward knew he'd have to start off slow. He'd have to get Jacob to trust him and become his friend. So long as Jacob was in his life, he could handle waiting years to mate with him. Being with him was enough. Do you want to hang out sometime? Edward asked. Sure, I guess. Since I'm new I need someone to show me around the town. There really isn't much here, it is only Forks. But still, will you show me around Forks? Edward knew Jacob would say yes. Jacob thought he was cute, a fact that made Edward want to leap for joy, which was a feeling he'd never had before, and Jacob wanted to spend more time with him as well. Sure, wanna do it tomorrow? Yes, Edward Said immediately. His enthusiasm caught Jacob off guard, but their conversation was stopped when Carlyle turned the corner. Edward. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were busy. It's fine, CA Dad. This is Jacob, this is my dad, Carlyle. Holy shit, they have good genes. At Jacob's thoughts, Edward's lips quirked in amusement, something that wasn't missed by Carlyle. Carlyle watched Edward out of the corner of his eye while he extended his hand to Jacob. Hello Jacob, it's nice to meet you. Hello sir, Jacob said quietly. Where do you live? I live in La Push. Jacob said. Not being familiar with vampire behavior, Jacob didn't notice when Carlyle stiffened, but Edward did and he knew he was in for an uncomfortable discussion. Edward, what is this boy's last name? Carlyle asked him. Edward ignored him and focused all his attention on Jacob. So I'll see you tomorrow, Jacob. Yeah, sure, what time? 10 a.m. We need to make sure we see everything. This is Forks, Jacob retorted, dryly. We start at 10 and we'll be done by noon. Edward smiled and said, still, I'm sure we can find something to do for the rest of the day. Okay. If you want to be bored all day, I'll see you at 10. Carlyle tugged on Edward's sleeve to pull him away from Jacob, but Edward refused to budge. Edward pulled himself free and growled at him. Too low for Jacob to hear. Carlyle's eyes widened and he backed up from Edward. I'll be in the car, Edward. There's nothing wrong with it, I don't know why Alice insisted we come here today. But they're sending it home with us because they're overloaded and it isn't a serious problem. I'll be right there, Dad. Carlyle didn't say another word and soon Edward was once again alone with Jacob. Meet you here at 10. Edward confirmed. Jacob nodded and kicked his shoe against the ground. Sounds good. Bye Jacob, Edward sighed. He wanted Jacob to look at him again, he needed to see his mate before he had to leave and not be able to look at him until the next day. The situation Edward found himself in was unusual for a vampire. Usually once a vampire found their mate, that was it. From that moment on, they were together always, especially in the beginning stages. Everything in Edward's instincts resisted leaving Jacob in this alley, but he knew he had to. Jacob wasn't ready to be his yet. And Edward needed to force himself to acknowledge that. Edward's wish was granted when Jacob looked up, and Edward knew that Jacob didn't want him to leave either. Bye Edward. With a final glance back at Jacob, Edward left the alley and found Carlyle sitting in the car. As soon as he slipped into the passenger seat, the tension was palpable. What is Jacob's last name, Edward? Carlyle finally asked. What does it matter? Edward, what is his last name? Black, Edward muttered. Carlyle's grip tightened on the steering wheel and the leather groaned under the pressure. Do you understand the risk you are putting our family in? He is a Black, he's probably Billy Black's son. He is. So you understand the situation this puts us in. Edward, what were you thinking? Do you know what the tribe will do to us if they find out you were talking to him? That you're meeting him? What could compel you? They want us to stay away from them. He's my mate. Carlyle gasped, and all words were lost. Your mate? Edward nodded. Alice has been seeing him for a while. He's why she made us go to the mechanics, not for the car. She told me to go to that alley. I can't stay away from him, Carlyle. He's young, Edward. That's why I'll be his friend right now. It can grow to something more when he's older. But right now, I just have to be with him. Carlyle was quiet as he thought. No one from the Quileute tribe can know that you are meeting him. I know. If they did, they would force him to stay away from you. In fact, they'll probably tell everyone in the tribe that we're to be avoided. Do you think Jacob will go against his father and tribe for a boy he's just met in an alley? Edward couldn't help his smug smirk. He's intrigued by me and attracted to me. Plus he doesn't like being controlled and he's very defiant. I think that he'll ignore them simply out of curiosity. You know that I can't explicitly condone this behavior. If Billy were to come to me, I'll try to protect you, and I'm certainly supportive, but I also have to protect the rest of the family. I understand, but I am happy for you, Edward. I am thrilled that you finally found your mate. You have waited so long. Edward grinned and could barely contain himself from gushing about how wonderful Jacob was. Instead he smiled out the window and lost himself in thoughts of his mate. His phone rang and Edward looked down to see that there was another text message from Alice. You're welcome. The moment Edward was through the door, Alice flew through the room and attached herself to his arm. Tell me all about him. What's he like? What's his name? When are you seeing him again? Alice, calm down, Edward laughed. What the hell are you talking about? Rosalie demanded. It was only then that Edward noticed the rest of the family sitting in the living room, staring at him in shock. They were all astonished at the wide grin on Edward's face, something they had never seen before. Normal Edward was contemplative and stoic, and when he smiled it was small and controlled. This Edward was radiating happiness. Edward's mate, Alice chirped. What? Esme gasped. My mate, Edward grinned. His name is Jacob. Emmett muttered to Rosalie, you owe me $20, dear. Told ya Edward swing that way. And he's wonderful. Edward finished with a glare at Emmett and Rose. And he's from the Quileute tribe, Carlyle added, softly. His words killed the joyous mood in the room, and Edward couldn't help but glare at Carlyle as he came into the room and sat beside Esme. Really, Edward, you would do the one thing that would make this place dangerous for us, Rosalie growled. Rosalie, calm down, Carlyle commanded. Emmett wrapped an arm around her and rubbed her hair, trying to keep her calm. Edward cannot help who is his mate, as everyone in this room knows. We judged none of you for your chosen mate and you will do the same for Edward. We do, however, have to discuss what you will do about this Edward. I will get to know him, Edward sighed bluntly. His next step seemed obvious to Edward. Despite the problems, despite the obstacles, the next step was to see Jacob again. It would always be the next step. Like hell you will, Rosalie roared, wrenching herself from Emmett's strong grip. The entire family is now at risk because of you. What you need to do is stay far away and forget him. I will not, Edward growled. He tensed, waiting for Rosalie to make a move, and watched Emmett tense as well, preparing to protect his mate if necessary. I would never deny you your mate, and I refuse to allow you to deny mine. That's different. Emmett posed no risk when I found him. This mutt of yours could destroy our family. Edward's growl was deep and ferocious. And he took a step towards Rosalie. Never, ever, call him that again. I would never put this family in danger, and neither will he. You don't know that, Jasper finally spoke up. Betrayal hit Edward hard in the gut. He had expected Rosalie to be pissed, but he had thought the rest of the family would be supportive. Edward realized how naive that had been. EY would all be cautious and untrusting of Jacob. Edward's shoulders slumped and he couldn't think of a response to appease his family's fears. I trust him, he finally said. But you don't even know him, Jasper pointed out rationally. I'm not saying that we make sure you're chaperoned whenever you meet him, or we monitor your every word, but you do have to be careful what you tell him. I won't lie to him, Edward warned. But I will be smart about what I reveal. But if he asks me, that's all we can ask, Esme said, effectively ending the discussion. No one would go against Esme, and if she hinted that the attack on Edward was over, it was over. Alice jumped in then, taking her cue from Esme. So how did you meet? I saw him in the alley, but that was it. Edward's brilliant smile turned and he launched right into telling his family about meeting Jacob. The next morning, Edward eagerly waited for Jacob at the mechanic's shop. He had spent the entire night convincing his family that he would be as safe as possible. The only people in his corner were Alice and Esme. They had complete faith in his ability to keep everything quiet. Carlisle and Emmett were hesitant, but optimistic. But Rosalie and Jasper seemed convinced that Edward would screw up and force them to have to move again. Despite their reactions, though, Edward couldn't make himself care. All he cared about was Jacob. Edward fidgeted, something he would never tell anyone about. Ever. Because vampires do not fidget, as he looked at his watch, counting down the seconds. Edward had never really cared about time before. When you have all the time in the world, the distinction between 5 minutes and 5 hours is completely pointless. But now, waiting for his mate to show, Edward found that 5 minutes could seem like a lifetime. He shifted on his bike seat, blinked, and anxiously looked around again. He hated not being able to take his car. The privacy it afforded was wonderful, and Edward felt very exposed sitting in the open air on the bicycle. But it wouldn't do to draw suspicion or attention so soon. And a supposed 15-year-old driving a car would certainly draw attention. He waited a while longer and then checked his watch again, and had to resist the urge to break the thing when it showed that only a minute had passed. Jacob was taking forever, and Edward was slowly losing his mind. Just as he was about to rip out his own hair, Edward saw Jacob riding down the street on his bike. Edward straightened in his seat and watched Jacob's every move. His thoughts were hesitant, but Edward was thrilled that Jacob felt the same excitement that he did. Jacob pulled up next to him and Edward got off the bike. Hello, Edward Said. Hi, Jacob replied. Edward smiled at him and Jacob blushed and looked away. Edward's smile widened until he was sure he looked like a maniac. So, where are you going to take me? He asked, when Jacob didn't say anything. I don't know. I hadn't really thought that far ahead. Jacob said. He scratched the back of his neck and looked away from Edward as he tried to think of where he could take Edward. He was nervous, Edward could tell, but what really made Edward happy was that Jacob really wanted him to be impressed with the town. Jacob's thoughts were consumed with where he could take this new boy that he so desperately wanted to impress. He wanted to make sure Edward wanted to stay there, and he wanted Edward to think he was cool. It made Edward practically keen with glee that his mate wanted him to like him so much. I'm willing to go anywhere, Edward Said. Hoping it would prompt Jacob to say something. I told you there isn't much here. I don't know what you want to see, Jacob admitted. Edward didn't want to push Jacob or make him feel uncomfortable. So he decided to help him. How about you show me the high school? I should probably see where I'm going to school. Yeah, sure, I guess I can do that. Don't know why you'd want to go there, though. Jacob muttered. Well, what would you want to see? The movie theater, the comic book store, or the bowling alley? Jacob explained with a grin beginning to form on his face. No, the cool things. Well, he amended, there really isn't anything cool in Forks. But I'd definitely not go to the school. Why do you want to see somewhere that you'll have to go to all the time? I like school. Edward shrugged. Jacob scoffed in disbelief and Edward had to stifle a laugh at Jacob's disgusted face. But take me where you like to go. Show me the cool things. Jacob grinned and pushed his bike into the alleyway. Then we're going to the bowling alley. They have games. My dad won't let me get any video games, so when I'm not going into Forks to visit the mechanics. You mean, for you to raid their dumpsters? Jacob blushed and he turned defensive. If they're going to throw away good parts that just have some dents, then what's wrong with me using them and fixing them up? Nothing at all. Edward sighed, raising his hands up to show Jacob that he didn't mean any harm. I just wasn't expecting to see anyone diving through the dumpster for a gas can. Did you use it, by the way? Yes, I did, Jacob said, looking quite smug and proud of himself. After I got most of the dents out, I put it in the car I'm building. Perfect fit. Why did you start building cars? Edward asked. He stowed his bike next to where Jacob had left his behind the dumpster where they first met and jogged to catch up with Jacob who was already walking down the sidewalk. My father was a mechanic when I was growing up, so he taught me a lot of what I know. I've always liked tinkering with things, so I learned quickly. Now, Jacob trailed off and Edward could hear him debating whether to mention his father's accident. Edward was disappointed when Jacob decided that it was too soon. Now I just use it for a bit of side work. Plus it gives me spending money and I'm getting experience for later. Later, when I'm older, Jacob explained. I'm not really the school type. So I'll probably end up working in my dad's old shop. You're only 13. There's still time for you to decide what you want to do. No, I'm really bad at school, Jacob said, shaking his head. I don't know. I get restless in class and then I can't focus so I miss everything during lessons so I don't know how to do my homework. Then, even if I do the right reading, I can't remember what the book said. Won't the teachers help you? Or can you get a tutor? Edward asked. Jacob shrugged and kicked a pebble on the sidewalk. The teachers don't really pay much attention to me and well, tutors are expensive and my father doesn't really have that kind of money. By the end of the sentence Jacob's voice had dropped to a whisper and his thoughts turned to shame. But Edward couldn't pay attention to any of that. His mate had just given him the perfect opportunity to spend a lot of time with him. Edward was pretty confident that Jacob wouldn't be learning anything Edward didn't already know like the back of his hand. I could do it, he quickly spoke before Jacob could change the subject. What? I could tutor you, Edward sighed. I learned everything last year anyway. You can bring your books to Forks and we'll do homework. No charge, he added when he saw the hesitancy in Jacob. Are you sure? Jacob asked. Yeah, I told you that I like school and I really like teaching people. Come on, it'll be fun. He nudged Jacob's shoulders trying to get him to agree. Yeah, sure. But you don't have to. You know, I don't want to be annoying. I'm pretty sure I'll never be annoyed with you, Edward honestly said. Jacob's face reddened once again and he ducked his head to try to hide it. But Edward still saw the blush. He found it wonderful and, though he would never, ever tell Jacob, it was charming. Suddenly Jacob's face broke out into a grin and he began running as he called out over his shoulder to Edward. We're here. Come on, we need to get there and make sure the cool games are open. Edward smiled at Jacob and ran to catch up with him. They spent hours playing games. Jacob won most of them, though Edward had let him win several times. Even though he had never played most of the games, his ability to catch on quickly and to think through situations in an instant helped him master all of the games after only a few rounds. But the look of self-satisfied glee on Jacob's face whenever he won and the disgruntled pout he got the first time Edward beat him was enough for Edward to start to fake losing. After Jacob got tired of beating Edward, they went to the dingy food court and Jacob ordered some slices of pizza. Aren't you going to eat? Jacob asked after he had already eaten 2 slices of pizza and Edward hadn't touched his. I'm just not very hungry, Edward lied with a shrug. Big breakfast. So you're not going to eat that piece? Jacob asked as he eyed the last slice. No, by all means. Edward pushed the plate towards Jacob, and with a speed that impressed even Edward, the slice was snatched from the plate and in Jacob's mouth. "So, you like food, huh?" Edward couldn't help but ask with a smile. Jacob swallowed his bite and then glared at Edward. "So, I like pizza. What's wrong with that?" "Nothing's wrong with it," Edward Said in defense. "Just an observation." Quote, "Well, you don't like food, then, huh?" "Just an observation. I just don't have a big appetite," Edward Said, vaguely. "Yeah, well, I'm growing," Jacob replied back. "So I've gotta eat." "Yes, you are," Edward muttered to himself so Jacob couldn't hear. He was almost ashamed of his words. After all, Jacob was only 13, and, mate or not, didn't dare. They to have a 100-year-old vampire perving after him. But Edward couldn't help it. The call of his mate was too much to handle. So while his fantasies definitely only featured an older, legal-aged Jacob, Edward couldn't help when his imagination sometimes got away from him. Edward looked up at Jacob and noticed that he had been talking without realizing Edward had been caught up in his own little world. He forced himself to listen to what Jacob was saying. "Theater. There must be an action movie or something. Our movie theater sucks and they only have 3 screens, but usually there's always at least one action movie on. There's always a stupid romance, though," Jacob grumbled. "You want to go to a movie?" Edward clarified. "Well, only if there's something good on. The theater's on Main Street. So it's a good place for you to see. The library is there." "The library?" Edward asked, sitting up in his seat. "Then let's go to Main Street. I wouldn't mind seeing the library." Jacob cocked an eyebrow at Edward before he rolled his eyes and pushed his plate to the middle of the table. "Fine, I guess I can do that. It's a bit lame, but..." Edward shrugged and stood. "I like school." "So you said." Jacob was horribly unenthusiastic about going to the library on his day off from learning, but he still managed to talk the entire way. There. Once they reached the library, Edward knew this would be the best place for them to meet for tutoring. At the end of the day, when Edward decided it was getting late and time for Jacob to get home so he didn't raise suspicion, Edward recommended that they meet the next day at the library. Jacob wasn't thrilled, but he eventually agreed. When they separated after walking back to their hidden bikes, Jacob left first and Edward watched him go. He didn't look away until Jacob turned the corner at the end of the street. As soon as Jacob was out of sight, a red sports car pulled up next to him. Edward didn't need to look inside to know it was Rosalie in the driver's seat. He put his bike in the back seat and got into the car, shooting Rosalie a thankful smile. "Alice mentioned you'd be done now. I thought I'd save you the hassle of taking the bike home." "Thanks, Rose. So how is your Quileute boy?" Edward smiled and leaned back in the seat. "He's perfect. You're going to see him again, aren't you?" Rosalie said in a tone that reflected her torn state of mind. While she was blunt, harsh, and protective of the family, Rosalie was not without a heart and did understand the need and want for a mate. "Tomorrow," he confirmed. "I'm going to tutor him in some of his classes." "Look, you know where I stand on this," Rosalie said. "But I understand the pull he has on you. I know you were lonely, surrounded by all of us, and I am glad you won't be lonely anymore. Just be careful." "Jacob won't hurt me," Edward insisted. "I'm not worried about that boy. I saw the look he gave you before he rode off. He's too young to understand what he's feeling. But that boy adores you." "It's a bit too soon to say that," Edward argued, despite the thrill the idea gave him. "Even so, he's not an issue. But his family and tribe, that will be a problem. So just be careful." "I will. I know what we're dealing with, but I won't let that hold me back from my mate," Edward Said with firm resolve. "I won't." Their first tutoring session was slow and halting. Jacob was smart, but he lacked the motivation and attention to study or do his homework. Another problem Edward quickly identified was that Jacob had too much responsibility on him. Since he was single-handedly taking care of his father and he didn't have enough time to do his schoolwork. "I don't remember learning any of this," Jacob admitted. Edward flipped the pages of the high-story book he was holding before stopping on the assigned chapter on the Civil War. "Well, what do you remember learning, then?" "None of it," Jacob growled in frustration. "I even think I read that chapter, too. But I can't remember anything." Edward doubted some of that. "I think you'd actually remember more of it than you think. You stress yourself out, Jacob. You're blocking what you know by Telling yourself that you can't remember anything. What are you, my shrink? Jacob muttered under his breath. Well, actually I do have my PhD in cognitive psychology and an MD in psychiatry and internal medicine, Edward replied, wryly. Jacob blinked and stared wordlessly. I'm joking, Edward lied. That was a lame joke, Jacob said. Totally horrible. Like a kid your age could be a doctor. Edward laughed along with Jacob. But inside he winced at his words. There was so much he couldn't tell Jacob, not yet, and it upset him even though he knew it was necessary. What I was trying to say, though, is that you need to stop beating on yourself. Stop telling yourself you're bad at learning and just see what happens. Jacob crossed his arms across his chest and leaned back in his seat. Fine, we play it your way, Freud. So how do we start? Well, first of all I'm going to ask you some questions and we'll see what you remember. Questions from the book. Edward smirked. Maybe. One of my brothers is a Civil War buff. So I know some things. Plus I learned this last year. Jacob smiled, but he fidgeted nervously in the chair. What if we find out that I really don't know anything? Had if I'm too stupid to learn this stuff. Edward moved without even realizing it. His hand covered Jacob's and he spoke with complete earnestness. You're not stupid, Jacob, and you do yourself a disservice by saying you are. Jacob had tensed when Edward had touched him, but in the face of his nervousness he seemingly forgot to wonder why Edward was practically holding his hand. But what if I am? You're not, Edward repeated. But if we find that you don't know something, we'll just go over it again. And if I don't know anything, then we'll start at the beginning. Edward picked up the history book and turned to the chapter Jacob was studying. He didn't need the book, but he decided that it wouldn't hurt to use it for guidance on what Jacob was supposed to learn. There was no nay. Ed to quiz Jacob on things he would never need to know. Edward cleared his throat dramatically, eliciting a small smile from Jacob, which was just what he wanted. He kept the questioning lighthearted so Jacob wouldn't be nervous. And whenever Jacob became frustrated or irritated they quickly moved on. Jacob remembered some things, but a lot of it he was too nervous to even attempt. He'd stutter through the questions, grow red in the face, and start beating up on himself in his head. Edward read Jacob's mind throughout all of it. It was endearing how nervous Jacob was. He desperately wanted to impress Edward and he didn't want to appear stupid. He didn't think Edward would want to spend time with him if he was too young and clueless. Edward longed to assure him that nothing Jacob could do would drive Edward away. It really was frustrating to not be able to tell his mate just how much he meant to him. And Jacob was too filled with teenage angst and insecurity to understand it, anyway. Once they were done, Edward shut the book with a definitive snap and dropped it on the table. See, that wasn't so bad, was it? Jacob frowned. I sucked. I didn't even get half right. Well, no, Edward admitted, but you got some correct. Right, so you retained something you read or heard in class, despite your insistence that you can't pay attention or remember anything. But what about everything I didn't remember? Edward grinned and leaned over to rustle in his bag. After a few moments, he smirked triumphantly and proudly placed a blank notebook and several colored highlighters and pens on the table in front of Jacob. We're going to take color-coded notes on your reading, he excitedly exclaimed. The excited smile on Edward's face quickly morphed to confusion when Jacob groaned loudly and dropped his head onto the table. Oh God, you're a nerd. Color coding. What have I gotten myself into? There's nothing wrong with color coding, Edward sighed with a pout. There's everything wrong with color coding. Here I thought you were this really cool guy, but the whole time you've been a closet nerd. I'll have you know that I get straight A's, Edward retorted. Because you color code your notes? Jacob asked, skeptically. Yes, Edward sighed, even though it wasn't true. He'd get perfect marks without even trying. It was one of the perks of being a vampire. Though, he would admit, occasionally he would write in different colors. It passed the time in class and the different inks gave him something to look forward to. Red for important terms, purple for dates, and gray for side notes. Plus whatever color ink is in my pen at the time. Though I like to use blue blacks for math. And sometimes, when I'm very bored, I write with pink, he finished with a wink at Jacob, who had gone glassy-eyed. Edward decided to throw one final thing at him. Maybe if you're good, I'll let you play with my fountain pens and inks. At that, Jacob turned his face into his crossed arms and muttered, I knew it. Such a nerd. I thought this was going to be fun. It will be fun, but we're here to help you learn this. So, we're going to read the chapter together, paragraph by paragraph. After each paragraph we're going to talk over what was important information, then we'll take notes and highlight what we need. Jacob sighed, but he obediently opened the notebook, though EDW. Ard could see how much Jacob wasn't looking forward to it. It took several hours for Edward to get Jacob through the chapter and the library was beginning to close before they were done. Well, what do you think of our first tutoring session? Jacob finished throwing his things in his bag before he graced Edward with a reply and a withering glare. Oh, I feel just great. I just feel like I was mind raped. No big fucking deal. It took everything in Edward not to bust out laughing at Jacob's little temper tantrum. Yes, well, that's what happens when you aren't used to studying. Jacob's scowl deepened into a glare and he turned his back to Edward to pick up his bag. Edward couldn't hold back a small snort this time. Jacob hefted the bag over his shoulder and began walking away from the table without a backwards glance. But Edward was after him in a second. So I'll see you tomorrow then. No fucking way. We didn't even touch your civics homework, Edward reminded him. Don't care. I'll make you a deal. There's nothing you can say that will make me come back here tomorrow. What about free food? Edward bargained. Jacob stopped in his tracks and after a brief moment of consideration, angled his body slightly to face Edward. Keep talking. We'll meet at the diner. You can have whatever you want, on me, for the entire time we're there. Jacob shifted from foot to foot indecisively. Until finally the appetite of a teenage boy won out. Fine, we'll meet tomorrow. But you better make good on your offer. And I'm going to eat everything I can to make you pay for today. Be my guest. Then I guess I'll see you tomorrow, Jacob said. Same time and I promise it'll be fun, Jake. The last thing Edward heard before he was too far away was Jacob's doubtful thoughts, tinged with his excitement at meeting again. When Edward entered the diner for their next tutoring session, he was only slightly surprised to find Jacob already there, head tucked in a book and an M.T. plate and several milkshakes around him. Edward stayed in the doorway for a moment and observed Jacob. He was studying for their session because he didn't want to seem stupid like the last time. In fact, he had purposefully made sure he paid attention in class that day and had even color-coded some of his notes. At least he had before the rest of the class saw what he was doing and made fun of him. So instead, after class, he had come to the diner and highlighted the notes. Once he was done there was still time before Edward would arrive, so he began reading through his civics book. Edward was proud of him. But he didn't delude himself to think it would last. Jacob wasn't a studious person by nature, and Edward didn't think he would change that. He didn't want to change that. Jacob W. As fine as he was, that didn't mean he had to flunk out of school, though. Not with Edward for a mate. Hello, again, Edward saw Ed as he dropped into the booth across from Jacob. Jacob dropped the book and stared wide-eyed up at Edward. Edward could only smirk and look pointedly at the schoolbook, which Jacob quickly tried to cover up. Studying. You wish, Jacob shot back, taking a big drink of his milkshake in the process. Hardly. Edward drawled with a grin. I'll be happy if you just do your homework. Fuck you, Jacob muttered, though there was no anger or frustration in his tone. He was embarrassed at being caught, and didn't want Edward to make fun of him or make such a big deal about it. Well, good job, anyway, Edward saw Ed, being careful to seem as casual as possible so Jacob wouldn't be uncomfortable. I'm glad. Some of my tried and true study techniques have rubbed off on you. Edward leaned down to get his notebook and pens out of his bag when Jacob's thoughts stopped him short. I've got other things you can rub off on. Edward froze and looked at Jacob from the corner of his eye. He was blushing and intentionally looking out the diner window. Edward slowly got his tea.Hings from his bag while he composed himself. Jacob's thoughts were normal for a 13-year-old boy, and Edward's response was normal for a vampire encountering his mate. But Edward knew he couldn't do anything about it. For what would surely not be the last time, Edward wished Jacob had been older. It would be a delicate balance to maintain Jacob's interest, which, in theory, shouldn't be hard. As Jacob should feel pulled to Edward because of the mate bond, while pushing him away subtly for their own self-control. He didn't want Jacob to feel like Edward was rejecting him just because he was too young to reciprocate. By the time Edward was done getting his things, Jacob seemed to have composed himself and was diligently slurping on this milkshake and eyeing the menu for another one. "So, how was school today?" Edward asked. "Fine," Jacob answered, vaguely. "Did any of our work pay off yesterday?" Jacob shrugged and played with his straw. "I have a quiz in history tomorrow. I guess we'll find out. Well, after we go through your civics, we can revisit your history." "Nothing like yesterday, just a refresher course," Edward sighed. He looked to Jacob for any signs of protest, and, when he found none, he gently took Jacob's civics book from his hand. By the time they were done studying, Jacob had consumed 3 more milkshakes, a burger and fries, and a large soda. Whenever he ordered something new, Edward could only stare in awe and wonder where it all went. "Well, I think that if you stay calm you'll ace the quiz tomorrow." "Yeah, well, that, if, part is the problem. I'll panic. I always do," Jacob grumbled. "Don't think like that," Edward insisted. "If you start to panic, stop, breath, and go to a question you do know." "I don't want to talk about school anymore," Jacob said, rather defensively. Edward understood Jacob's frustration. He was also beginning to realize that Jacob was more of an avoider on problems he really didn't want to solve. And school was a problem that Jacob really didn't want to solve. Ever, if possible. "All right, so what do you want to talk about? You like it here? Well enough. It's a nice change of scenery, I guess, but I move around a lot. It's hard to really enjoy a place if you know you're just going to leave in a few years." Jacob dropped his head and began to tear apart a napkin. "So, you're going to be leaving here soon." Edward regretted his words as soon as they were out of his mouth, because he knew exactly what they sounded like. And he knew better than anyone else in the world that being transitory wasn't good for building close relationships. "No, my dad has said that this is it. At least until we graduate. Then who knows where we'll go to college." That was about all the comfort he could offer Jacob. Besides, by that time they'd hopefully be mated, and then Jacob would know Edward wasn't going anywhere. Edward just had to tell himself that it would all work out. Even if some sacrifices were necessarily, his mate was worth it. "How many places have you lived?" Jacob asked. "I think I've been to about 8 different schools," Edward sighed. Of course, the truth was somewhere more in the hundreds. "Wow, I can't imagine that. I've been stuck here my whole life." "You're not old enough to be restless yet," Edward teased. "I'm not," Jacob whined. "It's more like, I know I'll always be here. And while I love my tribe, it kinda sucks." "Tell me about your tribe." "Well, we're not very big here. At least not compared to some. My dad's the tribe elder, but that doesn't really mean much nowadays. Mostly we get together to celebrate festivals, have storytelling, you know. Stereotypical stuff, I guess. But I grew up with it, so it doesn't seem weird. I love hearing the stories of my ancestors. Because we all gather around a campfire, have food and drinks, play games. It's like a party, only we do it several times a year," Jacob said. "That sounds like a lot of fun." "Yeah, maybe you can come sometime." "Maybe." Edward sighed, hedging a full commitment. He'd never be allowed on the reservation, and he didn't want to think about what Jacob would do if he ever found out why. It could destroy them. They were able to study for 7 months before they were caught by someone from the res. They were back at the diner again, studying for Jacob's math exam, when the door to the diner's swung open and an older man stomped his way over to their table. "Jacob Black, what are you doing here?" "With him." Jacob looked up in shock. "Harry, what are you doing here? I believe I asked you first. What are you doing with a Cullen?" Jacob raised his eyebrows and looked at Edward. "Edward's been tutoring me. I'm passing all of my classes because of him." "What's wrong, Harry?" Harry never once met Edward's eye. He grabbed Jacob's elbow and hauled him up off the seat. "Come with me, your father will want to know about this." "Sir, please, Edward started, but Harry shot him a look that let Edward know he would only be digging a deeper hole if he continued to speak. Jacob, meanwhile, was busy gathering his things and looking back and forth between Harry Clearwater and Edward. Once he was done, he followed Harry out, but stopped at the door to glance back at Edward. "I'll call you," he mouthed, before he left. Edward wanted to believe him, but he didn't think Jacob's father would let him. He nodded and smiled, trying to convey that everything would still be okay. But Jacob was confused, and while Edward didn't think Billy would actually tell him the real reason he didn't want him to be talking with Edward, he was sure that Jacob would be torn between obeying his father and his desire to spend time with Edward. Jacob didn't talk about his father much. After a few months, he had opened up enough to give Edward a brief history of his family, including the death of his mother. But he knew enough to know that Jacob looked up to his father. He loved him deeply, especially since, in Jacob's mind, his father was the only family that stuck around long enough to take care of him, and wanted his father to be proud of him. Spending time with Edward would go against everything Billy desired. Edward anxiously wanted for 3 days, until on the 4th day Edward received a phone call at 1 in the morning. He looked at his phone and picked up the second he saw it was Jacob. "Hello, Edward, it's me," Jacob said. His tone hushed. "Jacob," he breathed, "it's great to hear from you. Yeah, sorry it took so long for me to call you. My dad has been guarding me. This is the first time I managed to stay awake long enough to call you." "Well, I'm glad you did. What happened?" "Well, my dad wasn't pleased. He didn't make a lot of sense, really. He kept muttering about your family and promises. But eventually he said your dad did something to piss him off and now he doesn't want us hanging out. I even tried to tell him you were just helping me study. But nope, nothing. I'm sorry, Jacob. So, what's the verdict?" "I'm officially grounded, though why is still hazy. And I'm not allowed to see you anymore," he whispered. Edward didn't say anything to that. There really wasn't much he could say. So he waited for Jacob to say something more. After a few minutes of listening to Jacob's breathing, Edward couldn't wait anymore. "So," he prodded. "So, we should probably get better about sneaking out," Jacob said. That made Edward's undead heart leap into his throat. "Really? Even though your father won't like it?" "My father is being stupid," Jacob muttered. "And he's been plenty happy with my grades. And that's thanks to you. I just don't care about his stupid grudge against your dad. It doesn't affect us. I just don't want you to get in trouble," Edward sighed, hesitantly. "But I want to see you," Jacob admitted. Now that certainly didn't surprise Edward. In the months they'd spent together, Jacob's crush on Edward had only intensified, a fact that LLED Edward more than anything else ever had in his life to date. "Well then, how about you think of somewhere in Forks that no one will see us? I'm willing to go anywhere. Of course, we've been using the library and diner for months and until today no one noticed us. So I don't think it'll be too hard. We'll just find somewhere out of the way. You don't mind? I mean, I feel bad. My dad's being crazy and taking it out on you. You aren't pissed?" "Of course not, it's not your fault, Jacob. And we'll find a way. You're my only friend here, after all," Edward joked. "Only you could spend a year at a school and not make any friends when everyone in the school is throwing themselves at you," Jacob muttered. "Jealous, Jacob," Edward teased. "Don't be, I've no interest in the annoying kids at Forks High." He could almost hear Jacob's blush over the phone. It was endearing, how Jacob would blush. Edward was almost positive that no one else saw that side of Jacob. And Edward would jealously guard it so no one else ever would. Jacob's glorious blush was all his own. "Shut up," Jacob snapped back. "You're blushing, aren't you?" Edward asked. "Shut up." Edward laughed and shifted the phone to his other shoulder. "Well, it's about time you got to sleep, don't you think? You have school tomorrow." Don't remind me. How'd your math test go, by the way?" "I passed. I remembered all the tricks you told me. And even though you made me do those stupid problems over and over, it helped." "Great job, Jacob," Edward sighed, truly glad that Jacob was doing so well in his classes. "I'm proud of you. And you thought you'd never do it. I told you it would just take some study techniques. Don't you dare start talking about your study techniques." "But they work," Edward pointed out. If you're just going to talk about school, I'm going to bed. Just admit I have a point. Fuck off." "Night, Edward." "Good night, Jacob." Jacob decided on a rundown cafe on the outskirts of town. It was further away from the res than the diner was, and he knew for a fact that no one on the res had any reason to go to that part of town. So Edward would meet him on the edge of town closest to the res. And then together they would bike or walk to the cafe. Once Edward turned 16, it became a lot easier to meet. He would either pick Jacob up at the edge of the res or in town, then they would drive to the next town over. After a while, their meetings stopped being just about schoolwork and a lot more about getting to know each other. Jacob was a deep boy, he thought everything through before he made a decision. This natural tendency often conflicted with his natural teenage inclination to break the rules. He was also deeply passionate about building and repairing cars, but despite his talk, he didn't really want to make that his career. He just thought he couldn't do better. He wanted to travel, but never thought he'd have the opportunity. He wanted to be respected and well-liked. He was one of the youngest in the tribe, so was often seen as an annoyance or child. And as the time went on, Edward and Jacob developed a deep friendship. Both loved each other, though in different ways. Jacob still didn't understand why he was drawn to Edward, but from what Edward could gather from his thoughts, Jacob didn't care. He viewed Edward as his best friend. A best friend he was very, very attracted to. The most important thing was that they were never caught. Jacob never questioned too closely why his father didn't want him to see Edward. And Edward never pressed. They existed in their own little worlds. And both of them were quite content that way. Things didn't start to go downhill until Jacob was a month away from his 16th birthday. While before he ignored the main gang of kids his age from the tribe, they began paying attention to him. It wasn't that Jacob was weak-willed, or that he thought they were cool, but he was tempted by having friends within his tribe. Sure, he had the friends he'd grown up with, but as they'd gotten older they'd drifted apart. Jacob enjoyed being able to hang out with his friends again. But that meant he was spending less time with Edward. They were still closer than anyone else, but they didn't get to hang out as much. Edward hated it with a passion. He understood that Jacob had other friends, and he certainly didn't want to dictate who he could spend time with. But every moment they weren't together, Edward missed Jacob. And then on Jacob's 16th birthday, Jacob stopped calling. He stopped visiting. He stopped their study dates. All Edward got was a brusque email a week after Jacob's birthday that he said he was fine, just sick and couldn't hang out, and he'd let Edward know when he was feeling better. But Edward knew the truth. While there was no guarantee on who would turn into a shifter, Alice had told him Jacob's fate. And he knew that Jacob had been told the true reason the Quileute stayed away from the Cullens. The only thing he didn't know and Alice couldn't see was what Jacob would do once he had all the information. Would he ignore all the rules of the pack and see Edward as much as he could? Would he feel betrayed that Edward hadn't told him? Would he refuse to ever see Edward again? All Edward could do was wait. Jacob flopped onto the couch in the living room and popped the lid on his soda before searching the couch cushions for the remote. Once he found it, he turned on the TV and started searching for something to watch to pass the time until he was meant to meet with Edward. His birthday was only a day away. And he wanted nothing more than to spend his birthday with his best friend. Quill and Embry had suggested having a bonfire on the beach and inviting the tribe, but Jacob didn't want a large party. He just wanted to spend time with Edward. He'd spent several hours trying to dissuade them, but no matter what he said, Quill and Embry kept planning a party. Eventually, he just gave up and assumed they'd be upset when he never showed. Really, he was hoping that at their meeting tonight he could convince Edward to take him to Port Angeles or Seattle the next night. He'd also be lying to himself if he didn't hope his birthday would lead to other changes in their relationship. He'd been half in love with his best friend since the moment they met, but he was always too shy to do anything about it. Not that he expected Edward to feel the same way. Edward was smart and handsome, and he had the pick of the girls at his school, and could probably get any of the girls at La Push school too. But sometimes Edward would say something or look at him in a way that gave Jacob a little bit of hope. And he really did hope. His phone chimed next to him with a text message. Jacob picked up his phone and smiled at the message. "I'm heading there now, sorry about the delay today. See you in an hour. Edward." Jacob quickly sent a reply back and shut off the TV so he could get his backpack and books and start to head over to their designated meeting spot. Edward had told him that because of the nice day his parents had decided to take them for a hike. They wouldn't be getting back until after dark, so their study session had to be delayed for a couple of hours until Edward got back and could pick him up. Jacob had offered to cancel, but Edward insisted that they still get together. That was fine with Jacob, he hadn't wanted to miss a meeting with Edward anyway. Jacob stopped in the kitchen to get something to eat, but as he turned around to leave his father was blocking the doorway. "Hey, Dad, what are you doing here? I thought you were at Harry's." "Jacob, there's something I need to talk to you about," Billy said. He wheeled backwards and went into the living room. Jacob followed but stopped in the door. He finally noticed that his father wasn't alone. In fact, their living room was completely filled with tribal elders and the tribal gang that Jacob had spent some time with recently. Quill and Embry stood in the back corner grinning at Jacob. Their expressions didn't make Jacob feel that something was wrong, but he was still confused about why everyone was there. "What's going on?" he asked. "Sit down, son. There's something we need to tell you." Jacob hesitated for a moment. "Can it wait? I need to go somewhere." "No, it can't wait. Nothing you could do would be more important than this." Jacob didn't agree with him, but he was stuck. He couldn't tell them the truth of where he was going and there was no other excuse strong enough to get him out of this. Resigning himself to having a long apology phone call with Edward, he dropped his bag and sat on the couch in front of everyone. Billy positioned himself in front of Jacob and looked at him with dark, intense eyes. "Now Jacob, tomorrow is your 16th birthday and that is the day you'll come into your tribal inheritance." "My what?" "It's something every man in the tribe is born with. But it is only activated in a few and only during certain generations. You know our stories, you've heard them your entire lives." "What are you talking about?" Jacob asked, getting annoyed at the confusing conversation that was keeping him from Edward. He was failing to see what was so important. "For the past week have you been running a fever, feeling nauseous, dizzy, or muscle pains?" Sam asked. Jacob looked to the young man that he had only really started to get to know. He'd been confused when Sam started talking to him. Up until a month ago, Sam was one of the older kids that would tease him or ignore him. Then suddenly he started treating Jacob like an equal. "Yes," Jacob said, nodding. He'd had all of those. He just thought he was getting the flu or was stressed because none of the symptoms lasted for very long. "That's your body preparing itself for your inheritance," Sam said. "I still don't understand." "Jacob, do you remember the tale of the Cold Ones? The story of great men who could assume the forms of wolves to protect the tribe from the Cold Ones?" "Yeah, I remember them. They aren't just stories, son," Billy said, taking over the conversation. "Those legends were based on truth. Every man in our tribe is born with the possibility of being able to transform into wolves, but it is only in certain generations when the change is needed and a few men will gain the power. You, Jacob, have been given this ability. Tomorrow you will begin to undergo the transformation that will allow you to shift and within a few days you will complete your first shift into a wolf." Jacob could only stare blankly at his father, then he looked around at everyone else in the room. "He's making this up, right? My dad's lost it. We're all meeting here so you can tell me my dad's gone nuts, right?" Sam managed to crack a smile, but he shook his head. What really worried Jacob is that everyone else shook their heads with him. "You really believe this crap?" Jacob exclaimed. "It's not crap, Jake," Quill said. "I thought just as you, but let me tell you friend, it's very, very real." "It's the Cullens," Billy said. "They're the Cold Ones, vampires, and when they moved here, our genes activated and some of you boys have gained the ability. And Jacob, you're next. You've been gifted with the ability to guard our tribe from those leeches." Jacob scoffed, but the looks he was getting made him nervous. It wasn't until Sam, Quill, Embry, and two other kids Jacob hardly knew named Jared and Paul took him into the backyard and he saw it for himself. Once they FTED back to normal and changed back into their clothes, Jacob went back inside, sat back in his place on the couch and demanded they repeat everything. It was a very long night and at the end of it Jacob wasn't sure what to think. He believed what the elders said about his ability to change into a wolf. He'd had the proof right in front of his eyes and they all said he was displaying the symptoms that occurred a week before the transformation when the body was preparing for the change. His body temperature was trying to regulate itself, his muscles were stretching and constricting to adapt to a larger profile. And even his digestive tract and other organs had to undergo a change that would allow his body to develop fully as a human and still be able to completely change as a wolf. But At worried Jacob the most was the information about the Cullens. He finally understood why his father had refused to let Jacob spend any time with Edward. He was retold the old legends of the Cold Ones. And Billy even showed Jacob the old tribal logs, where his grandfather recorded the first meeting with the Cullens. Jacob was shocked to see Edward's name in a note written in 1948, and another WRITTEN a few years later when they left Forks, but the log gave descriptions to help future generations identify them in case they returned and didn't report their arrival. One description matched Edward D almost perfectly and another matched the man that Jacob had first seen Edward with in the alley. He couldn't deny the truth, no matter how much he wanted to. The only problem he had was what to do with the information. No matter what the stories said, Jacob just didn't believe that Edward would ever hurt him. For a brief moment he wondered if Edward had been trying to use him either to gain information on the pack or else to gain his trust just to hurt him. But almost as soon as he thought it, Jacob felt guilty for the cruel thoughts. He knew Edward better than anyone and he knew Edward would never do that. Not to him. He tried to think of more logical, and less crazy and overdramatic, reasons that Edward would spend time with him knowing full well where Jacob came from and what he would probably become. In the end, after ideas ranging from the plausible money or teaching experience for college applications, to the more outrageous the long con fraud or CIA agencies employing vampires as spies for domestic terrorism. He finally ended up on only one thing: Edward liked him and wanted to be his friend. But he didn't want to go against his father and tribe. Sam didn't allow him much privacy in the weeks following his birthday. His very first shift was the day after his birthday. Jacob had never felt so much pain in his life, but it was thankfully quick. He would later learn that his was the smoothest transition the pack had had. Jacob felt very sorry for the other members. He couldn't imagine the shift being worse. It had been in the morning. His birthday hadn't been anything like he wanted. Edward had sent him several text and phone calls, but Jacob couldn't respond to any of them. Or didn't want to. He still wasn't sure. Later that night his fever returned with a vengeance and his muscles hurt so much he couldn't move. Sam sat up with him throughout the night and early in the morning he led him into the woods. There, with the help of Quill and Embry, he helped Jacob complete his first transformation. The change was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. One moment his body was on fire and his limbs felt like they were being stretched beyond their limits. And just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the image of a large russet wolf appeared along the tree line surrounding them. Suddenly the wolf charged at him. Jacob tried to scream but no sound came out and then the wolf jumped. The moment the wolf came into contact with his body, Jacob felt his limbs elongate and morph. His eyes shifted and when he looked down he saw a muzzle instead of a nose. After a few seconds the pain was completely gone and Jacob the wolf was left panting, laying on his side. For the first time he noticed that the rest of the pack had also transformed around him. "Jacob, you up, bro?" A voice filled his mind and only because Jacob recognized the voice did he know that it belonged to Quill. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped and looked imploringly at his friends. "You can't talk when you're a wolf, idiot," Embry said. "This is how we speak, remember? With the mind." Jacob certainly remembered that part. He'd tried to block it out because it also meant he had every thought that passed through his head would be left open to the pack. Jacob had dangerous secrets that he really didn't want the pack to know about. He'd spent almost every waking moment that wasn't focused on sorting through what to do about Edward, trying to figure out how to hide his thoughts about Edward from everyone else. "I remember," he thought, his stomach falling at the thought. He knew he was supposed to feel proud of the inheritance. His father had even told him that by right the alpha position Sam held was his, but he couldn't think of it as anything more than an annoyance. Sure, he enjoyed running in the forest and it was nice to belong to the pack, but it seemed like he was trapped. He'd always felt deep down that no matter how much he wanted to, he most likely would never be able to leave the reservation. He'd never get to travel or be able to afford to go to college to get a good job. But there was always the small hope that maybe he'd get lucky and could really do what he wanted. Those hopes had only grown when he'd met Edward. But now they were crushed. The inheritance essentially tied him to the tribe for the rest of his life. Jacob didn't want that responsibility. He wanted to live his own life and he resented that an accident of birth now dictated how he had to live his life. It was suffocating. It was eventually these thoughts that led him back to Edward each time. Jacob knew Edward would never let someone force Jacob to do something he didn't want to do. Edward had talked about taking him traveling. It was Edward that tutored him so he could escape the reservation and make a life for himself. He wanted to continue to see Edward, and 3 weeks after his first change he had actually picked up the phone to call him. He'd only communicated one other time by sending Edward a quick email saying he was okay, and so was nervous about how Edward would respond to his long absence. But as soon as his thumb was hovering over the call button, he turned off his phone and threw it to the other side of his bed. While he had already decided that he wanted to continue seeing Edward regardless of the pack's grudge, there was one other thing that worried him. Imprinting. Jacob liked the idea of having a soulmate, someone who would stick by him for life. Late at night he'd imagine a world where Edward was his imprint. Edward would take him away from the reservation. They'd travel and he'd never have to worry about others controlling his life again. Sometimes his father traveled with them because, out of everything, Billy was the only thing Jacob loved on the reservation, and even in his wildest dreams it was only Billy that would keep him there. But Jacob knew it wouldn't happen. He wouldn't imprint on Edward, and that would break Jacob's heart. It would only lead them away from each other because Jacob's life would become consumed with the pack and Edward would move on to the successful life he was destined to have. So after a time, he began to avoid returning his calls or emails just so he could continue with his far-fetched fantasies of a life with Edward. But a month after his birthday, Jacob had had enough. It had been a hard day of patrols, and Sam had yelled at him for accidentally falling asleep during his shift, even though it was his fault for keeping him out until the early hours of the morning doing another shift. And to top it off, he learned that he'd failed his math test and was once again on the verge of flunking out of school. At his wits' end and with tears in his eyes, Jacob lost his resolve and was dialing Edward's number before he even registered what he was doing. He didn't have to wait long. On the second ring there was a click, and finally Jacob heard the voice he had missed so much. "Jacob, Edward Saeed. Jacob, is that you?" Jacob gulped and nodded before remembering that Edward couldn't hear him. Yeah, it's me. Oh God, Jacob, I've been frantic with worry. What the hell happened to you? Suddenly you aren't showing up to our meetings, you never return my calls." Jacob thought about what he wanted to say, but only one thing came to mind. He needed to hear the truth from Edward's lips. "Is it true, what you are?" he asked in a whisper. There was a pause over the phone before Edward answered in an equally quiet tone. "Yes. And did you know what was going to happen to me? I had my suspicions. I didn't know if I wanted them to be true, but it doesn't change anything for me." Finally Jacob let out a sob. "I'm a monster, Edward," he said, finally confessing one of his deepest worries. "When I turn, the rest of them are stuck in my head and all I want to do is run away from it all. But now I'm stuck here. I have all these hours that I have to spend running around trying to protect the tribe from you and your family, even though I know you'd never hurt us, and I only get a few hours of sleep. I'm flunking out of school, but I don't have the time to study or even attend classes sometimes between my responsibilities to the pack and taking care of Billy. I just, he trailed off, not knowing what it was he wanted. He just wanted someone to listen and understand. He couldn't talk to his pack mates about it. They were either going through the same things or else it was something he couldn't discuss at all. Jacob somehow knew that it was only Edward he could tell anything to. "Meet me tonight or tomorrow. I don't care when. We can talk about anything you want, Jake. I'm not supposed to talk to you." "It didn't stop you before," Edward pointed out. Jacob had to give him that. "I didn't know what you were before. And what am I? The enemy? Do you really believe I'm your enemy, Jake?" "No," Jacob said. He could never think that of Edward. "Can you meet tonight? I really need to talk to you, and it's been so long, and I just need to talk to you." "Of course. If you can get out, I'll pick you up at our normal spot. We can go to Hat 24-hour diner with the pies that you like." "I've missed you," Jacob said, needing to get it out. "I missed you too. So much. You'll pick me up. 1 hour. I'll be there. Bye, Jacob." "Bye," Jacob said. He hung up the phone and stowed it in his pocket. Now his problem was getting off the reservation without getting caught. Billy was watching a football game at Charlie Swan's house and was planning on sleeping on the man's couch so Jacob didn't have to worry about him. He couldn't shift because he didn't want any of his pack members on patrol to notice him. So he kept to the shadows and listened to everyone around him to make sure he wasn't followed. Once he reached the end of La Push Road, he stood in the shadows of the trees. He only had to wait a few minutes until headlights appeared on the horizon. Despite being nearly invisible to the human eye because of the shadows, the car stopped directly in front of Jacob. He bounded out of the trees and ripped open the door. Jacob made to get inside but took a moment to look up at the man he had missed for a month. As soon as the car light illuminated the much-missed face and Jacob looked into his eyes, his entire world shifted. Jacob's breath caught and his heart raced. He could see Edward's eyebrows drawn down into a concerned expression and his mouth was moving. But none of it registered. Nothing was as important as his realization. Jacob Black had imprinted. Jacob, are you all right? Jacob blinked at the words that finally registered. He didn't know how long Edward had been trying to get his attention, but he hadn't been able to look away from the sight of his imprint. He'd known Edward was handsome, but with his wolf controlling a part of his mind, Jacob could make out the soft glow of Edward's skin and the subtle colors of his hair. There was a heavenly smell of magnolia, bonfire, and grass, but Jacob could also make out scant traces of a horrible bleach smell. It lingered around Edward but wasn't oming from him, which Jacob was thankful for. Jacob, Edward yelled, and finally Jacob blinked again and realized where he was. He still hadn't fully entered the car yet, so he was hanging out of the door, mouth hanging open, and staring at Edward like an idiot. He didn't want to think about how long he'd looked like a dumbass in front of Edward. Jacob blushed and quickly climbed into the car. Edward raised an eyebrow at him, but Jacob couldn't find his voice to speak. He stared out of the front window trying to sort through his thoughts. Chief among them was, I've done it. I finally imprinted. And it's Edward, like I wanted. Thank God. However, those thoughts were quickly followed by, how the hell am I going to explain this? Edward tried to strike up a conversation during the ride. But Jacob could barely think about a response, much less talk. Before he knew it, he was sitting in the diner, a soda and glass of water on one side of him and a large piece of lemon meringue pie on the other. You must be pretty out of it if you haven't already blown through that piece and ordered another by now, Edward commented lightly, his eyes never leaving Jacob. Huh, Jacob could only say. Edward raised an eyebrow and nodded towards the pie. Are you going to eat that? Jacob stared at the pie and picked up his fork. He dragged the fork along the meringue while he tried to figure out what to say. Did he just jump in? Confessed to Edward. Even in his imprint-muddled brain, that didn't seem like the best approach, even if his wolf was one slip away from embarrassing him beyond anything he'd ever suffered before. In fact, if his wolf had its way, Edward would already be naked and pressed against him. Jacob let out a strangled sound at that thought and his face turned beet red. He didn't help the flood of images that raced into his mind at that throwaway thought. Edward naked, it was a thought he hadn't truly let himself consider seriously. But now it was difficult to not think about a naked Edward. He wondered if his body was covered with the same brilliant copper hair, or if he was smooth. Did his skin glow under his clothes as it did on his face? How would his lean fingers feel around? Jacob choked as the thought entered his mind and he felt his face heat up more than it ever had before. Edward looked like he was trying to contain a smirk, but Jacob was too distracted to pay much attention or question Edward's odd behavior. Why Edward would sit silently while Jacob was clearly having a mental breakdown, when anyone else would be pushing for information or trying to help, didn't register with Jacob. All he could try to do was keep his hormone-rampant teenage body in check long enough to figure out how he was going to tell his best friend, the person he trusted above everyone, that he was a hairy wolf boy who was now magically instrumental in his life. Despite all of the training he'd gone through when he first shifted, no one had broached imprints. Yako. B really wished there had been some sort of class on how to tell your imprint. He wanted pointers. Or handouts. A handout would work, something he could thrust into Edward's hands, run far away, and then return in a week or so when Edward would have had time to read it and process everything. Fuck, why did so many of their legends have to be told orally? He'd kill for someone to have written everything down in one handy guide. So you find yourself a wolf boy, or, congratulations, you're my imprint, a guide on human wolf boy mating habits. In fact, he'd probably be a hero to the coming wolves if he'd write that himself. Maybe he could get Edward in on the act. He liked geeky things like collating and referencing. It'd be like the weirdest form of foreplay ever. Or a really lame date. Edward snorted and Jacob shook himself out of his thoughts. He blushed when he realized how long he'd been sitting there silently like an ass. His pie had been smashed to pieces, and now that it was butchered Jacob had to suppress a frown. He'd really wanted that pie. "And are you back from La La Land, now?" Edward asked. Jacob nodded and tried to put his pie back together with his fork. "We can just get you another piece," Edward suggested. Jacob shot him an affronted look. "And waste a perfectly good piece of pie? I don't think so. I'll eat this one, and then we can get another." Of course. Edward grew quiet and Jacob distracted himself by eating up his destroyed pie. Once he was done he ordered a piece of coconut cream, and then finally looked up at Edward, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Are you ready to talk now?" Edward asked. "Talk about what?" Jacob evaded. Edward let out an undignified snort, something Jacob had been sure Edward would never be able to do. An undignified Edward just seemed wrong. Somehow, and leaned back in his chair. "Talk about what's on your mind. Where you've been for the past few weeks. Take your pick." Jacob grumbled and suddenly became very interested in a crack on the table. He wanted to tell Edward, he really did. But what the hell could he say? "I don't know how to start," Jacob finally admitted. "I mean, it seems like you know, but I don't really know if you know and if you don't." "No, I don't want to. You've just said a lot of loaded nothing," Edward pointed out with a smile. Jacob didn't resist his urge to stick his tongue out at him. And when Edward cocked his head and narrowed his gaze in a challenge, it was like those last few weeks had vanished. "I'll help you out," Edward said quietly so they wouldn't be overheard. "I know what you are. Just like you know what I am. I'm sure you were told about our previous visit." "Yeah," Jacob nodded. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that you supposedly met my grandfather." "Did you?" "I did," Edward confirmed. "We were here for a few years before leaving again. I hadn't wanted to leave, there was something about your grandfather that drew me towards him." Jacob tried hard to stomp down on the sudden jealousy that welled up in him at Edward's words. It was ridiculous to be jealous of a fleeting moment between his imprint and his long-dead grandfather, but Edward was his imprint, damn it. And he didn't want there to be strong connections between anyone that wasn't him. It wasn't rational, but the wolf didn't care. Edward was his. "Oh," he said, mental. Why wincing at how tight and angry his voice sounded. Edward chuckled and nodded. "Yes. I didn't know why, but there was just something about him. Then we came back because Esme, my mother, loves it here and loves our house. So then I met your father. I was confused when I felt the same pull to him as well." Jacob practically ground his teeth together at that thought. His wolf was going crazy, wanting to claim Edward so no one could take him away. And to make it worse, Edward had this all-knowing smirk on his face that pissed Jacob off. Here he was suffering and Edward was having fun. "I didn't know why I felt drawn to them until I met you," Edward ended softly. Jacob vaguely heard what Edward said, but his mind was too filled with horrible images of Edward leaving him for his father, or worse, his grandfather. His wolf was plotting ways to get back at his grandfather in the grave. His human mind struggled for control, but he couldn't help the growl that slipped out of mouth. "You're not listening to what I'm saying," Edward said. It was only his soft, melodious voice that broke through Jacob's thoughts of patricide. "Oh, I heard you just fine," Jacob tried not to growl out. "No, why? Or getting caught in your head like usual and creating elaborate fanciful ideas of what you think is going on even though they have no basis in reality. You always exacerbate things in your head. I do not. You have a wild imagination. Most of the time it's lovely, but then you worry, doubt yourself, and make things worse." "This isn't just something I can spit out," Jacob said. "Tell me, Jacob. You'll feel better when it's out." Jacob sighed and began fingering the faux wood grain of the table and running his finger along the crack again. He froze when Edward's hand suddenly covered his. He looked up into his imprint's eyes and suddenly wished that Edward could just know what he wanted to tell him. He couldn't vocalize it. He didn't have the words. Edward had always been the one with the words. Something in Edward's eyes changed and he nodded at something. He leaned forward and rested his chin on the hand that wasn't covering Jacob's, studying him. Jacob just sat, waiting for something. Did you know that before we first moved here I studied some Native American legends? I remember some Quileute legends I read. My favorite was the story of the Mount Storm King ending the battle between the Quileutes and the Klallam tribes by killing all of them with a giant rock, causing the valley to turn into a river and then into a lake that became Lake Crescent. My father told me that one, Jacob whispered. He told me it was meant to teach that beauty and peace can come from terrible things and that war and violence must be punished. He took me there as a child and we'd off prayers to the Mount Storm King who is supposed to still guard the lake. It's a wonderful story, Edward agreed. I was also interested to learn that the Quileutes believed they were descendant from wolves. Imagine my surprise when I learned that they're still protected by wolves. Jacob ripped his hand away from Edward's and stared wide-eyed at him. But how did you know? He asked. You were told what I am, Edward Said. Jacob didn't answer, they both knew it wasn't necessary. Cold ones, I believe your legends call us. That is certainly true, you've felt me, I'm quite cold, though I don't feel it anymore. When we moved here we met with Ephraim too. Tell him about us and I saw it. Your tribe's warriors turning into wolves to protect the tribe. It was fascinating. I felt early on that you would become one as well. You saw. How is that possible? According to the legends people didn't start shifting until after you got there. Cold ones are supposed to trigger the ability. You're right. I saw it in Ephraim's mind. You what? I read his mind. It's a gift of mine, a rare one, I've discovered. The concept that Edward could read minds should have shocked Jacob. He should have rejected it outright. Called Edward a liar or crazy, and run as far away as he could. But despite how ridiculous it sounded, that little extra fact made everything fall into place. Suddenly the odd looks Edward would give him. The secret smiles, his ability to know exactly what Jacob wanted, needed, and was thinking made perfect sense. He was torn between being upset at the lack of privacy and thrilled that he'd never have to vocalize an uncomfortable thought again. I really try hard not to hear your thoughts, but I'll admit sometimes I indulge myself. You have fascinating thoughts and I enjoy understanding how your mind works. You mean I'm as much of an idiot in my mind as I am out loud? Jacob asked, horrified that Edward had been privy to every awkward, uncomfortable though. Edward grabbed Jacob's hand again and gave him a stern look. You most certainly are not an idiot, Jacob. And I don't like it when you belittle yourself. So you heard me earlier when I was thinking about. Jacob made a vague gesture towards Edward, hoping Edward would know what he was talking about. I did, though I don't understand what it meant. I've never heard you use the word imprint before, so I don't know what you were upset about. Single quote. Not upset, Jacob quickly corrected. I was just confused and I don't really know what to say to you about it. But I'm not upset. Then why don't you start by explaining what an imprint is? Edward suggested. He tried to remove his hand from Jacob's to sit back in his chair, but Jacob held tight to the cooler hand. It was a comfort of sorts to know that even with their odd situation, Edward wasn't repulsed enough not to touch him. Jacob quickly looked around the diner to make sure there wasn't anyone close by. They were completely alone in their corner and he trusted that between the two of them they'd know if someone was nearby. Right, so you know about the wolves, he started, softly. Not every male in my tribe has the ability to shift in. It's only when our enemies, the cold ones, are nearby. Am I your enemy, Jacob? Edward asked. No, Jacob firmly stated, shaking his head for added emphasis. No, Edward could never be the enemy. Even without the imprint, even just as his best friend, Edward would never be anything other than Edward. He'd never be a leech or bloodsucker, as he'd heard Sam and Paul hatefully spat out. He was just his Edward. Even though I'm a vampire. It was the unspoken word between them. Until then, Jacob's mind had provided handy euphemisms to dilute just what was going on in his life. But he wasn't Jew, shifter, and Edward wasn't just a cold one. They were werewolf and vampire. Two things that shouldn't exist, but did. But to Jacob, that made them more alike than different. Besides, he knew Edward better than most of the guys in his pack. Why would his loyalty to Edward be diminished by the opinions of people he barely knew and traditions, no matter how deeply he loved and respected them, generations old? It was possible to love his tribe, history, and traditions while still making his own choices. Even if you're a vampire and I'm a werewolf, he said. He knew that was the moment. It was the moment he admitted that he wouldn't be following the rules of the pack to the letter. He would always put something before the pack, and that something was supposed to be his mortal enemy. EDW. Ard clucked his tongue and squeezed Jacob's hand to get his attention. So melodramatic. I want to get back to what's so embarrassing for you. Come on, just what had you blushing so much earlier? You had too many thoughts running through your head for me to catch it specifically, but I do know that your face hasn't turned that red since we first met and you thought I was cute. Wait, you knew? Oh yes. It was adorable how much you'd try to impress me. Jacob sputtered, unable to find the words. He had so many opinions on what Edward had done, but one was more important than the others. Then why the hell didn't you fucking do anything? Edward shrugged. You were too young. I'm not keen on statutory rape. And I wanted to get to know you first. What do you mean, too young? We're only a couple years apart. Physically, yes. But when you're over 100 years old and the object of your affections is 14, it's best to take things slow. Wait a minute, Jacob sat up straight in his chair and closely studied Edward. Are you really saying you're over 100 years old? I was born in 1901. Shut the fuck up, Jacob said. He tried to mentally do the math, but he was too shocked. You're swearing a lot today, Edward commented. I've just found out you're over 100. 112. In human years. In vampire years I'm a quite young 95. Jesus Christ, you're old. Jacob said. I don't appreciate your commentary, Edward drawled. Anyway, yes, so I'm older than you. A whole fucking lot older than me, Jacob interrupted, earning himself a glare. But compared with my father who is over 400 years old, I'm quite young. Oh my god, I'm beginning to think this is just the weirdest dream I've ever had, Jacob muttered. Trust me, this isn't a dream. I'm experiencing this with you and I haven't been able to sleep since I was turned, Edward Said. Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but Edward held up his hand. We can talk more about me later. There's plenty of time, but now I want to hear what this imprint thing is and why it's so hard for you to talk about but so important you do so. Right, an imprint, Jacob muttered. Well, an imprint is, well, it's like a connection between two people. A connection, like a soulmate, Jacob whispered. He felt the blood rising to his face and he could tell from Edward. These raised eyebrows that he'd heard what he said. I see, Edward Said. So you're saying that according to this imprint thing, I'm your soulmate. It's not like a romantic thing, Jacob quickly had to explain before slouching down as if in hiding or defeat. Or, at least, it doesn't have to be. It can just be a strong friendship. Basically, it's the wolf finding its other half and we're willing to do anything. Be anything for that person. Do you want this to be a romantic thing, Jacob? Jacob's mind was screaming yes. Yes. But even though he knew Edward could hear that, he still said, I just want. What makes you happy? I see, Edward Said again, and Jacob had to resist the urge to throttle him for giving such a vague, unhelpful response. How the hell could he gauge, I see? What did that mean? Was that a, yes, let's be friends for life, or, what Jacob hoped, yes, let's make out and fuck like bunnies for the rest of our lives. He wasn't even mentally ready to examine what he really wanted from Edward. He was too young to fall in love, wasn't he? Did you know, Edward Said, breaking into Jacob's thoughts, that you wolves are not the only ones with the concept of a soulmate? What? Vampires also have mates, though whether they are destined as the term, soulmate, seems to imply is debatable. But we have mates. That one person who, once we find them, will become our world and spend the rest of existence with us. Jacob knew there was something Edward was trying to tell him. But he was too tired and overwhelmed by everything to try to figure out what Edward's sly words were implying. He knew what he thought Edward was trying to say, what he hoped he was saying, but he didn't want to read into it something that wasn't there. He was anxious and terrified all at once. What are you trying to say, Edward? He finally asked. Are you done eating? Edward asked. Jacob nodded and Edward took out his wallet and threw a handful of bills on the table. Perfect. We're going on a little trip. Where are we going? Edward smiled and took Jacob's hand. I'm going to show you where I realized that you were my soulmate. Thanks for watching.